I think we can get started at 6:30. So thanks for coming out for this teach-in. This is the first kind of like public event that Platypus is putting on at Georgetown this term. It's kind of a tradition for us to do a capital in history teach-in at the start of the term. So let me just say a little something about Platypus. I had it up here. The Platypus Affiliated Society, established in December 2006, organizes reading groups, public fora, research, and journalism, focused on the problems and tasks inherited from the old 1920s to 30s, new 1960s to 70s, and post-political 1980s to 90s left, for the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. We are a campus-based, student-led organization. I'm not a student, right? As you can probably tell, I'm too old for that. Which means that, if you think that more conversations like this should be going on Georgetown campus, we really need you guys to step up in order to kind of lead a Platypus organization here on campus. That's kind of how Platypus is designed. So if you think you might be interested in that kind of thing, please get in touch. We can talk after the teach-in or come to one of our coffee breaks. So our coffee breaks that we're hosting at More on Common Grounds, which is the cafe in the ICC, right by Red Square, meet Wednesdays at 5 o'clock. And then we're also going to be organizing a reading group, which is going to meet Sundays at 2 o'clock. For those of you who responded to the poll that I put out over email, thanks for responding. That seems to be the time that worked best for people. I don't have a room for that yet, but TBD. Actually just decided that was going to be the time.
Probably just here, right?
Yeah, if this room's available, that would be perfect.
It probably is.
Just like the good old days. Yeah. Sunday, 2 o'clock and 2:04. So I'll send out an announcement to the list with the time and place and the reading list and all of that stuff. So without further ado, let's get started. I'm gonna hope to talk for no more than about an hour, and then there can be time for questions, discussion, that kind of thing. So on the screen, I have kind of 4 different examples of prehistoric cave art. I don't know how familiar. Are there any cave art experts with us here today? I don't know about you, but like when before I saw some of the paintings that I have on the screen up there, maybe I'll dim the lights for just a second so you have a better view. By the way, if you have any questions or comments at any time, please jump in. It'd be cool if this was like, a discussion, conversational. So before I saw the paintings on the screen in front of you, I had a kind of like Flintstones idea of what cave paintings look like, right? It's like stick figures and like geometric shapes. It's very primitive, right? This is like, primitive man. This is what they're doing. And then, I saw these guys. Like, I had been to Joshua Tree, right? And there's these petroglyphs at Joshua Tree. And they look like that. They're like stick figures, geometric shapes, right? But the petroglyphs at Joshua Tree are really, really young. They're only a couple thousand years old, right? Whereas the 3 pictures that you see in the kind of top and left on the screen there, those are at least 12,000 years old. Some of them are as old as like 30 to 40,000 years. Right, so way, way older than the primitive stick figures, right? And to call them cave paintings actually is misleading, since the painting is only part of what Paleolithic man was creating. He deliberately sought out the darkest, most silent parts of the cave to make his art, which could only be viewed by torchlight and ember, and so the paintings would have presented themselves in sudden dramatic fragments. Now the rump of the bison is clearly lit, and now the head flashes its eyes at you. For this reason, Werner Herzog, in his documentary about the paintings at the cave in Chauvet, it's called, anyway, he has a movie about cave paintings, it's pretty good. For this reason, Werner Herzog calls them the first cinema. Right? So you're seeing these kind of like fragmentary glimpses, and it's kind of giving you this kind of picture emerging over time. But in addition to cinema, they are sculpture, incorporating the shape of the rock into what is depicted. One painting of clashing rhinoceroses places the point of contact in the center of a divot in the rock, like the V formed by the spine of a comic book, to intensify the drama. Even shallow textural features of the rock will present powerful shadows when lit by fire, as these were. This cave art is independent of any genre of art we practice today. Arnold Hauser, in his Social History of Art, describes them this way. So now I'm quoting. The accuracy of the drawing rises to a level of virtuosity which takes it upon itself to master increasingly different attitudes and aspects, increasingly fleeting movements and gestures, increasingly bold foreshortenings and intersections. We discover motion studies which already remind us of modern instantaneous photographs, the like of which we do not find again until we come to the pictures of a Degas or a Toulouse-Lautrec, so that for the eye unschooled by Impressionism, there must appear to be something badly drawn and unintelligible about these pictures. The painters of the Paleolithic age were still able to see delicate shades with the naked eye, which modern man is able to discover only with the help of complicated scientific instruments. Paleolithic art apparently takes possession without a fight of the unity of visual perception achieved by modern art only after a century-long struggle. It certainly improves its methods, but does not change them, and the dualism of the visible and the invisible, or the seen and the merely known, remains absolutely foreign to it. Right? So it's impressionistic, it's expressionistic, it's realistic, right? There's a naturalism, right? It's like, closely observing like what these animals look like and how they present themselves to you. All of this is going on in these Paleolithic cave paintings. These paintings were not produced as works of art to be admired by an audience, but as tools in the struggle for survival. There is evidence of man attacking these paintings with spears, a kind of killing in effigy. The magical identity between the animal depicted and the real animal would then ensure the success of the next hunt. Further evidence that they were not intended for the benefit of an audience is that Paleolithic man painted new paintings right on top of the old ones, even when bare wall was available nearby. Presumably, certain parts of the cave were more suited to the magic that was at play. The paintings in this remarkable style are painted one on top of each other in a palimpsest, which, on one wall at Altamira, is at least 5,000 years old. So the oldest painting, you can see it in the pictures, right? The oldest paintings, right, are like 5,000 years older than the paintings that are on top of them on this wall. The artists who painted those, the oldest and youngest paintings in the palimpsest, the artists who painted them were as distant from each other in time as we are from the ancient Egyptian New Kingdom, but their work is stylistically indistinguishable, right? Is anyone in here like an artist or have any artistic hobby or training, right? Like imagine, right, if you're an artist, right, imagine that you wandered into like a pyramid from ancient Egypt and you found some painting on the wall and you were like, oh, I'm going to draw something on top of it, and you matched their style perfectly. Like no notes, got it on your first try, exactly the same style that the ancient Egyptians were doing, right? It'd be impossible, right? It would take like years of careful study in order to like produce an authentic ancient Egyptian cave painting. You'd have to like learn all the rules of frontalism and so on. These Paleolithic man, they just walk into this cave, hasn't been inhabited by 5,000 years, and they paint a new thing in the exact same style. Then, all of a sudden, these paintings disappear, to be replaced by the crude geometric forms that you see in the lower right picture. So that one, right, the other three paintings are 12,000 to 30,000 years old. That one is only 4,000 years old. That's from Magura, Bulgaria. So here's Arnold Hauser again. The naturalistic style prevailed until the end of the Paleolithic age. That is to say, during a period of many thousands of years. No change took place until the transition from the Old to the New Stone Age, and this was the first stylistic change in the whole history of art. It was not until the naturalistic attitude, open to the full range of experience, yielded to a narrowly geometric stylization in which the artist tended to shut himself off from the wealth of empirical reality. Instead of representations true to nature, with loving and patient care devoted to the details of the object, from now on we find everywhere schematic and conventional signs, indicating rather than reproducing the object, like hieroglyphs. Instead of the concreteness of actual living experience, art now tries to hold fast the idea, the concept, the inner substance of things, to create symbols rather than likenesses of objects. The event which swept this remarkable Paleolithic cave art into the dustbin of prehistory was the agricultural revolution. Human beings went from being nomadic hunter-gatherers to living in settled agricultural communities. Paleolithic cave art was a kind of natural metabolic byproduct of the immediate struggle for survival by a mankind still enmeshed in nature. Right? Remember, it was magic to help them hunt. Right? After the agricultural revolution, man steps out of nature. He has to think his way back to it by representing it with symbols. The immediate intimacy with nature that Paleolithic man enjoyed is lost. Henceforth, even if some had wanted to opt out and return to a hunter-gatherer way of life, it would have been impossible. No human being can survive outside the new cooperative society which the agricultural revolution established. Perhaps we might feel agriculture was a terrible mistake. After all, the cave paintings got really terrible, and average life expectancy apparently went down in its wake. That's what the anthropologists tell us. But the wheels of history have started turning, and they only go one way. We might even feel, as Herzog puts it, that we are trapped in history, and they, the men who painted those caves, are not. Thoughts on cave paintings? I'm gonna try to stop in natural places if there's any questions or comments. All right, I'll keep going. The domestication of plants and animals, the advent of agriculture and animal husbandry, marked a transition from a mode of life founded on the appropriation of the means of survival, provided gratis by nature, to the production of the means of survival in and by society. This is the beginning of the organized production of man's needs by man. In unshackling itself from nature, it became possible for society to assimilate a surplus above and beyond what was required for immediate subsistence, and thus to sustain a non-laboring class, the priest-kings, the patricians, the Brahmins, the aristocracy. And these are the people who do things like make music, or play sports, or write poetry, or speculate about philosophy. Since production depends not on automatic nature, so not just like picking the apple that grows on the tree or chasing down the bison when it happens to cross your path, right? Production depends not on automatic nature, but on the existence of the society. The end of all activity is to preserve the civilization that makes this activity possible. What is good, right? And the words are almost synonymous for this kind of ancient civilization. The words endure and true are literally synonyms. They have the same root. If you trace it all the way back to Proto-Indo-European, the root means to endure, to stick around, right? So what's true is what doesn't change, what persists through time. The ubiquitous myth of these societies is of a golden age, from which all the practices and rituals of civilization depend. And we keep that civilization alive by repeating these practices exactly as they were, even if we inevitably fall short and our traditions are degraded. Although most people were peasants, those who practiced some form of specialized trade typically inherited it from their father. Every activity in society has its place in a cosmological vision of how the world was, is, and will continue to be. And the highest good was to preserve what is. It endured because it was good. And because it was good, we have a responsibility to make sure it endures into the future. I will call this form of society traditional civilization, and it spanned millennia. On the one hand, civilized man is always an individual man, particular, mortal, and fragile. On the other hand, he is a representative of society. He has a place and a task in the eternal cosmological order, and he therefore feels that he has a soul, something profound and eternal within him. What a strange idea. Not until he begins, this is a quote from Hauser again, not until he begins to breed plants and animals does he also begin to feel that his fate is directed by powers endowed with reason and with the ability to determine human destiny. Thus, the characteristic way that traditional civilization grasps itself is in what we would today call religion. So in his elementary forms of religious life, the sociologist Emile Durkheim has a beautiful description of how kind of religion is society, like, society's consciousness of itself. Durkheim writes, "We can say that the believer is not deceived when he believes in the existence of a moral power upon which he depends and from which he receives all that is best in himself. The power exists. It is society. Before all, religion is a system of ideas with which the individuals represent to themselves the society of which they are members, and the obscure but intimate relations which they have with it. This is its primary function, and though metaphorical and symbolic, this representation is not unfaithful. Quite on the contrary, it translates everything essential in the relations which are to be explained, for it is an eternal truth, that outside of us there exists something greater than us, with which we enter into communion." Exactly because society is not an alien force, right? So it's not like someone like came in here and beat your head with a club and said you're a member of society now, right? But you're like society, we live in a society, right? Do you guys know that? Exactly because society is not an alien force, but something we, its members, are tasked with producing and reproducing. For just that reason, Durkheim goes on, a God is not merely an authority upon whom we depend, it is a force upon which our strength relies. The man who has obeyed his God, and who, for this reason, believes his God is with him, approaches the world with confidence, and with the feeling of an increased energy. Likewise, social action does not confine itself to demanding sacrifices, privations, and efforts from us. For the collective force is not entirely outside of us. It does not act upon us wholly from without, but rather, since society cannot exist except in and through individual consciousnesses, this force must also penetrate us and organize itself within us. It thus becomes an integral part of our being, and by that very fact, this is elevated and magnified. Okay, so religion is consciousness of society, but it's consciousness of a particular form, right? It's consciousness of society as this kind of eternal, transcendentally good, unchanging thing, right? It's a thing which is greater than us, but also inside of us, right? It's in our souls. It is what is not nature. Nature and spirit, body and soul, appear opposed to each other. Civilization stands between man and a reversion to an animal existence. Durkheim talks about how, if you were a member of the owl clan, right, your ancestor was an owl, right? Your great-great-great-great-grandfather was an owl, right? That's how you became a member of the owl clan. And, you're always in danger of turning back into an owl, right, if this kind of civilizational form were to fall apart. You guys know the John Wick movies? Right, what's the line from the character in John Wick? Rules. Without them, we live with the animals. Right? That's traditional civilization. That's how it thinks about itself. It's interesting, right, that character in the movie is kind of ambiguous. Is he the good guy? Is he the bad guy? Not very clear. These traditional civilizations were caste societies. They were slave societies. And civilization, in all places and at all times, depended on the labor of the slaves to maintain that surplus which, strictly speaking, was the contents of civilization. To engage in any form of manual labor was a mark of slavery. It was a sign that you had been conquered. Labor comes to be associated in men's habits of thought with weakness and subjection to a master. It is therefore a mark of inferiority, and therefore comes to be accounted unworthy of man in his best estate. That's a quote from Thorstein Veblen, not a Marxist, just kind of a liberal sociologist in his famous book, the Leisure Class. Is that what it's called? Only those who do not work are truly men and are truly free. Even the slave revolts in antiquity, when they succeeded in winning their freedom, right? Did they like say like, okay, that slavery thing, that was like terrible. We need to make sure we don't have that anymore, right? No, they would go out, they would establish a city, and then in that city there would be slaves who did the work, because someone has to do it, right? They didn't do the work anymore, which meant they were free. I have a long quote here by this Christian theologian, David Bentley Hart. I'm not going to read you the whole thing, but the gist of it is like David Bentley Hart is saying, like, oh, Christianity comes along and like now we're all equal, we're all equal like children of God, right? We're all brothers in Christ. And therefore like slaves have to treat their masters with dignity and so on. But like Christians never thought you should actually like free the slaves and they shouldn't be slaves anymore, right? David Bentley Hart says, in Christ the distinction between master and slave had been abolished was at the very heart of the Apostle Paul's understanding of the resurrection. That this new reality might actually result in a society in which that distinction had been fully eradicated was a thing for which Paul obviously did not presume to hope this side of God's kingdom. As yet, the implications of the gospel remained, for him and for many generations of Christians after him, more a matter of eschatology than of social philosophy. Right? So it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of slavery in antiquity. Productivity was not a virtue. We were talking about this at coffee break the other day. Productivity was not a virtue because overproduction would disrupt the stable forms of communal life. Wealth was not and could not be the goal of production. Rather, the goal of production was to reproduce what is, the community. Where, as in classical Greece, there's a middle class that's able to begin to amass wealth beyond what their fathers enjoyed, there too the philosophers emerge to remind us wealth is not the good life. Wealth is only good as a means to authority, and authority is only good as a means to justice. So if your wealth is not held in some just proportion, some just mean, right, then it's not good for anything, actually. That's philosophy for you. Freedom in this epoch means the freedom to live in accordance with one's own nature. The freedom of the Athenian people is the freedom to speak Greek, worship Athena, and reside in Athens, not to be forced to speak someone else's language or worship someone else's god. To be conquered by another people is the ultimate argument, because it proves that one's society, one's god, is unable to endure, and therefore is not true. Although for millennia, human existence is aimed at the reproduction of what is, nevertheless there is history, which means that entire languages, cultures, and peoples are wiped off the map. The history of traditional civilization is the history of genocides. History means the abrogation and violation of every ancient freedom. It is Hegel's slaughter bench of history. So, prehistoric man, traditional civilization, right? Questions? Thoughts? Yeah, what's up, Ben?
Yeah, so you said that in traditional civilization, the idea was that wealth is, it's only useful as a means to authority, and authority is only useful as a means to justice. How would you square that with, I know this is kind of like a basic example here, for lack of a better word, but like in the Republic, when Socrates is arguing with Thrasymachus, whose stance is basically justice is whatever the strong want. Like it's clear that this was a brand new idea that authority had to be used for some greater purpose.
Mm-hmm. I don't know that I have necessarily like a reading of the Republic, but certainly it's this is a good point, right? Because it's not like it's just an affirmation of like whatever the strong wants. That's like what you have to agree with, right? There's in the very idea of religion, there's kind of a distinction between like the idea and reality, right? And the idea is this kind of like beautiful, true, eternal thing, and the reality can be and often is kind of a degraded form of the idea, right? So you can have tyrants, right? But tyranny would be first and foremost like someone who whose nature is different from yours, or who wants you to live in a way that's not in accordance with your nature, and they're using force to make you do this, right? That would be what tyranny is. I don't know if that answers your question, or...
No, I guess really the only thing I was confused about is like to what extent the sort of attitude you're talking about is universal, or... Because my point isn't necessarily that, like, someone somewhere, in ancient history diverged from this idea. It's more that, like, Socrates was essentially a radical for calling for something like what you're talking about. Like, he had to argue against the whole Athenian ruling class, and they killed him because he was too good at it, so...
Sure, right? He's articulating, like, a vision of what it means, how this traditional civilization, is supposed to be, right? That's, like, out of step with how, is actually happening. No, that's a good point. I like that. Like, Socrates the radical. Of course, he was a radical aristocrat. We shouldn't forget, right? He's, there is, like, Hauser, who I quoted a few times, he makes this point that it's like, there is a kind of incipient, like, bourgeoisie, that's how he sees it anyway, in kind of classical Greece, and therefore there's kind of counterattack by the aristocrats, and that counterattack is what we receive as, like, the philosophy and culture of ancient Greece, right? It was all an argument about, like yeah, you can be rich and you can even, like, command an army of people because you're rich, right? But you'll never be just the way aristocrats are, because we've been educated and habituated to be just. At least that's how Hauser sees it. Yeah.
Something that you brought up, which is the distinction between nature and spirit, the way that you put it is that if you are a member of, like, the Owl clan in traditional society, post the Neolithic Revolution, as you put it, it's almost this constant threat of being forced back into sort of prehistory, or sort of like being forced out of the loop, as you describe it, not being able to be to be in correct communion with your God, which is separate from nature. So I wanted to get your thoughts on maybe how, like, the idea of, like, as we would see it, like, criminal justice is different in traditional society from sort of, like, modern visions of, like, I wouldn't say thought reform, but that's the first thing that comes to mind, or rehabilitation.
I'm not quite sure I see the connection between criminal justice and the, like, reversion to nature. Can you...
In the sense that, as far as I know, in, like, these, like, medieval societies, in these, like, in, like, ancient Egypt, traditionally in media, like, you have, like, despotic, like, you have whippings, you have self-flagellation during, like, the bubonic plague, in a way that seems completely alien to us today, and is almost, like, caricatured.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, this came up at coffee break the other day, this question of the police, right? That there's no police in traditional civilization. It's not as though, like, the peasant caste needs to be kept in line by the aristocratic caste. The peasant caste is self-regulated, right? They keep each other in line. They keep themselves in line, right? And so what it would mean to be a criminal, if you're a peasant, is, like, you're not doing the thing that all of us peasants know peasants are supposed to do. You're doing something weird, right? You're going out there and, like, worshiping some weird cultic god, right? Or you're, like, drinking your whiskey out of the wrong sized glass or something like that, right? You're tilling your field from north to east instead of south to west. That would be, like, right, so it's, like, self-regulating in that way. And I guess I'm thinking of that because of this image of, like, self-flagellation and the whipping, like punishing myself, right, in order to try to end the plague and restore our good relationship with God, right? It's like you don't need someone to command you to live in accordance with your society in ancient civilization. You're going to force yourself to do that. I don't know if that speaks to your question or if you want to say more.
Yeah, maybe the sort of like the way in which punishment is also like a public phenomenon, like in like traditional depictions of medieval society of like people clustering around like the executioner or the hangman, and I think maybe that connects to what you're talking about with this sort of idea of like self-enforcement, that it's not so much that people are, or in the way that people are in awe at this sort of punishment that is sort of doled out, it's also something in which they know they have to participate in order to remain like civilized.
No, yeah, that's interesting. Other thoughts or questions?
I've been reading this book called Sand Talk by Aboriginal Australian author Tyson Yunkaporta. He discusses sort of the differences between the way that modern Western society exists and how the settler society in Australia conflicts with the Aboriginal society essentially used to work. As a matter of fact, it's coincidental. I guess I was just reading a passage today about how in traditional Aboriginal Australian society there's allowed a certain amount of interpersonal, I guess like minor violence as a way of settling disputes, I guess, what do you call it, doling out justice, as opposed to sort of more, or less personal rather, like state violence that is removed from, you know, with a certain amount of like small interpersonal violence that is public. They've sort of discovered that these conflicts are more easily resolved and stay unresolved. It's a more private matter.
Right. No. Yeah, that's interesting. It's like it's the right of everyone in the community. Like when someone breaks a law or does something wrong, it's the right of everyone in the community to punish them or do whatever's needed in order to kind of restore justice. Right. It's not like you have to go running for someone with a badge and say like, hey, please, you're the only one who can solve this. Right. There's something even, I mean, not to jump ahead, but there's something even kind of, potentially bourgeois about that imagination. Like Lenin makes this point that it's like, you see a woman being harassed in the street, right? Like anyone just naturally, instinctually is like, I'm going to stop, step in and put a stop to this. But something is like happening under capitalism that you can't just allow society to self-regulate that way. You need to introduce this, as it were, like alien occupying force, the police, in order to solve all of our disputes. What did you say that book was called?
It's called Sand Talk.
Sand Talk. Oh, that's cool.
Like sand, like on the beach.
Yeah.
Talk.
Oh, Sand Talk. Okay,
Yeah.
sorry.
Oh, talk, sand talk. Gotcha. All right, I'm going to keep going. In the cities of 15th century Western Europe, a new society was emerging. These cities were peopled by escaped serfs. The principle in Western Europe is city air makes you free. Right? So if you run away from the land and you live in the city for a year and a day, now you're free, and your lord can't make you go back to the land. So Western Europe, I mean, it's a total backwater, right? It's like this, these people have retreated from the beautiful, glowing urban civilizational centers along the Mediterranean, and they're out in these dark Teutonic forests, right? And they have this intensely rural way of life, and the serfs are owned by the land, right? And the duke owns the land, and so he owns all the people on it, who are just these kind of naturally occurring thank God there are these people who are doing things like growing grain, right? Because that means I can tax them and then support me and my family. Right? There's this total civilizational backwater, the Dark Ages, right? But in these kind of deserted formerly Roman cities, all of these serfs are running away from the land and they're living together in these cities. Something new is emerging out of this. Free tradesmen work for a wage and not for the sake of an obligation to the feudal social order. They use this wage to purchase the product of other people's labor. People made art, not for the glory of God, but to sell to other people. You don't need to depend on the fact that you share a cosmology with your neighbor in order to get him to make clothes for you or feed you. All you have to rely on is that he wants your money. Indeed, there are vaster differences between a tavern keeper and a weaver in the city than can exist in the country, where everyone performs the same planting and harvesting operations at the same time. You relate to your neighbor not on the basis of his being the same as you, but his being different. He makes those articles which you do not, or don't know how to produce for yourself. What is emerging is a new form of society, one founded on the free laborers of the city, the burghers, working and transforming themselves and their environment in free cooperative exchange. Freedom is inscribed at the base of the social order, but it is a new imagination of freedom, no longer the freedom to be in accord with one's own nature, but the freedom to become something altogether new. Freedom is open-ended instead of closed-ended now. This emerging bourgeois consciousness is captured by Giovanni Pico della Mirandola in the late 15th century in his famous Oration on the Dignity of Man. So it's like a famous kind of Renaissance document. So Mirandola is like going through the story of the creation and how like God gives each of his creatures a special gift, right? The giraffe gets a tall neck, so Mirandola probably didn't know what a giraffe was. But anyway, the giraffe gets like a tall neck, so you can like, eat the vegetables, and the mole gets like claws that you can burrow into the dirt with, and so on, right? Everyone gets their special talents. At last, the Supreme Maker decreed that this creature, to whom he could give nothing wholly his own, human being, right? At last, the Supreme Maker decreed that this creature, the human being, to whom he could give nothing wholly his own, should have a share in the particular endowment of every other creature. Taking man, therefore, this creature of indeterminate image, he set him in the middle of the world, and thus spoke to him, "We have given you, O Adam, no visage proper to yourself, nor endowment properly your own, in order that whatever place, whatever form, whatever gifts you may with premeditation select, these same you may have, and possess through your own judgment and decision. The nature of all other creatures is defined and restricted within laws which we have laid down. You, by contrast, impeded by no such restrictions, may, by your own free will, to whose custody we have assigned you, trace for yourself the lineaments of your own nature. I have placed you at the very center of the world, so that from that vantage point you may, with greater ease, glance round about you on all that the world contains. We have made you a creature neither of heaven nor of earth, neither mortal nor immortal, in order that you may, as the free and proud shaper of your own being, fashion yourself in the form you may prefer. It will be in your power to descend to the lower brutish forms of life. You will be able, through your own decision, to rise again to the superior orders whose life is divine." By the 17th century, this emerging new form of society, this transformation had left almost no aspect of Western European society unchanged, and the consciousness of this transformation is beginning to be expressed by the thinkers of the High Enlightenment. Indeed, the very word society, as an abstract noun, right? So not like, I enjoy him, I enjoy his society, he's good people, right? But like, we live in a society, that kind of society, right? The very word society dates to this period, along with sociable, socialized, sociability, and so on. Also, the word self, right, is acquiring a new meaning. So self, we come to have this idea of like, there's something within me that's like separated from everything that's outside of me. There's a self that's different from what's not myself. And a whole bunch of new words come along with that. Self-seeking, selfish, self-made, self-conscious. People are reaching for new words. Why? Because they are trying to describe things of which they are newly conscious. John Locke coins the phrase civil society, which is translated into German, Bürgerliche Gesellschaft. Philip taught me this. Translated into German as Bürgerliche Gesellschaft. I'm sorry for my bad German pronunciation. And then back into English as bourgeois society. right? So civil society, bourgeois society, they're literally the same phrase, right? It's just game of telephone. So I'll use them as synonyms. In this new society, what is no longer the good, right? What endures is no longer the measure of truth. The distinction is made between what is and what ought to be. And what a thing is appears in bourgeois thought to be only a moment in the process by which that thing becomes what it ought to be. To know what a thing really is, don't study what it is, but think about what is it becoming? What has it been? What is it going to be, right? What ought it to become in the future? In ancient civilization, to give an account of a thing, to explain why it is or how it came to be, means to justify it, since what is good. Right? So you have all these just so stories, right, about like, why are there rainbows? Because God made a covenant that he wasn't going to kill us anymore, right? Okay, that's why we have a rainbow. It's a good thing that we have rainbows. For bourgeois thinkers, to give an account of a thing is to critique it, to point out that it has not yet become what it really ought to be. It has all the resources in it that it needs to become something other than what it is. The category by which bourgeois society unfolds these new social relations in thought is the category of labor. This is labor as such, not this or that particular form of work, but the capacity of every man to transform nature into something else open-endedly. So here's John Locke. Though the earth and all inferior creatures be common to all men, yet every man has a property in his own person. This nobody has any right to but himself. The labor of his body and the work of his hands, we may say, are properly his. The work of my hands are mine. Whatsoever then he removes out of the state of nature that whatsoever then he removes out of the state that nature hath provided and left it in, he hath mixed his labor with, and joined to it something that is his own, and thereby makes it his property. It being by him removed from the common state nature placed it in, hath by this labor something annexed to it, that excludes the common right of other men. For this labor being the unquestionable property of the laborer, no man but he can have a right to what that is once joined to, at least where there is enough and is good left in common for others. Right? So I pick an apple from a tree, I've affixed my labor to the apple, it's my apple now, right? You come by and grab the apple out of my hand and run off with it, you've stolen my apple. Right? It's wrong of you to do that. Right? Go pick your own apple. This is my apple that I picked. Why? Because of my labor. So think about how radical of an idea Locke is expressing here, right? For thousands and thousands of years of human existence, to work, right, is a sign that you are unfree, that you're unfit to participate in civilization, right? That you're not entitled to like the property, the temples and the tapestries and all of that stuff, right? Because you're a conquered person, you're a laborer. Locke is saying, no, actually, all of the property in society belongs by right to those who work, to those who make this stuff, right? And then Locke goes on to, he does his calculations, he does his figures, and he computes 999 out of 1,000 of all of the useful items on Earth are the products of labor, right? So therefore, 99.9% of that social surplus, civilization, is by right the property of those who work, not the aristocrats, those who work. This idea that labor is the source of value is famously taken up by that great dialectician and political economist, Adam Smith. Right, so Smith says, the value of any commodity, therefore, to the person who possesses it, and who means not to use or consume it himself, but to exchange it for other commodities, is equal to the quantity of labor which it enables him to purchase or command. Labor, therefore, is the real measure of the exchangeable value of all commodities. Smith is a moral philosopher who's attempting to grasp this new bourgeois society in thought. And the category that he gives himself to grasp it is the division of labor, right? So we are each occupied with our own limited labor, but there's something kind of like greater than all of us, greater than the sum of its parts that's emerging and making us all wealthier. That's this division of labor. It's an image of bourgeois society. it's going on, as it were, behind our backs, right? Even though all we intend is to, make a day's wage, or buy a pretty dress or something, right? Behind our back, there is this kind of like emerging social wealth that everyone benefits from. That's Adam Smith's idea. The invisible hand, right? Even our vices can be put to good use by society, which we might say is beyond good and evil. Okay, so here's Adam Smith's account of how feudalism, how the aristocrats lose their power, right? You ready for this? All for ourselves and nothing for other people seems in every age of the world to have been the vile maxim of the masters of mankind. As soon, therefore, as they could find a method of consuming the whole value of their rents themselves, they had no disposition to share them with any other persons. Right? So it used to be if you wanted to show off how wealthy you were, you had to have a feast, and you had to feed 500 people by doing this. But no longer, says Smith. For a pair of diamond buckles, perhaps, or for something as frivolous and useless, they exchanged the maintenance, or what is the same thing, the price of the maintenance, of 1,000 men for a year, and with it the whole weight and authority which it could have given them. The buckles, however, were to be all their own, and no other human creature was to have any share of them, whereas in the more ancient method of expense, they would have had to have shared it with 1,000 people, already said that, Smith. With the judges that were to determine the preference, this difference was perfectly decisive. And thus, for the gratification of the most childish, the meanest, and the most sordid of all vanities, they gradually bartered away their whole power and authority. A revolution of the greatest importance to the public happiness was in this manner brought about by two different orders of people who had not the least intention to serve the public. To gratify the most childish vanity was the sole motive of the great proprietors. The merchants and artificers who supplied them these baubles, much less ridiculous, acted merely from a view to their own interest, and in pursuit of their own peddler principle of turning a penny wherever a penny was to be got. Neither of them had either knowledge or foresight of that great revolution which the folly of the one and the industry of the other was gradually bringing about. Right? So aristocrats, they just want to buy things that they don't have to share with anyone. And the merchants just want to make a penny wherever a penny is to be made. And in doing that, the merchants bankrupted the aristocrats, and therefore the feudal aristocratic order comes tumbling down. And a new, free social order is now capable of being built. This is Adam Smith's historical narrative. Of course, Adam Smith, hates slavery, right? Because slavery is the violation of the freedom of labor. Okay, this teaching is titled Capital in History, so I have to say something about capital, right? For Smith, capital is simply labor. It is what has been saved from past labor, converted into the means of production, so that labor can begin again more productively than before. Capital, then, is only a moment in the ongoing process of labor transforming nature and itself. So what is capital? It's like some tools that I bought with the labor that I performed in the past, and now I can perform better labor in the future. It'll be even more productive because I have these new tools. That's what capital is for Adam Smith. It's just a moment in this kind of ongoing labor process. Okay, I'm not doing well on time, so let me skip some paragraphs. The Wealth of Nations is published in 1776. That same year, there's another famous literary event, the American Declaration of Independence. At the same time that the high Enlightenment consciousness of society is expressing itself, there is a political attempt to overthrow the ancien regime. If the workers are not conquered slaves, but free members of society, then the state of the old conquerors must be replaced by a republic disciplined to the needs of society. Or as Rousseau put it, the state must be disciplined to the general will. The question, as Hamilton put it, was whether societies of men are capable of establishing good government from reflection and choice, or whether they are forever destined to depend for their political constitutions on accident and force. Inspired by the American Revolution, there's a revolution in France, right? On the eve of the French Revolution, the Abbé Sieyès is expressing the aim of this revolution, right? The aim is that the first estate, those who pray, and the second estate, those who fight, meaning the clergy and the aristocrats, are going to be wiped out of the political order, right? And all political power is going to devolve to the third estate, those who work, right? Sayez asks, what does a nation need to survive and prosper? It needs private employments and public services. All the different kinds of private employments can be grouped into 4 classes. And it goes on to list agriculture, manufacture, commerce, and services. These are the activities that support society. But who undertakes them? The third estate, those who work. The third estate thus encompasses everything pertaining to the nation, and everyone outside the third estate cannot be considered to be a member of the nation. What is the third estate? It is everything. So that's, right, the French Revolution, putting those who work in charge. Looking back at this profound social reorientation that has occurred, Karl Marx writes, the ancient conception, in which man always appears, in however narrowly national, religious, or political a definition, as the aim of production, seems very much more exalted than the modern world, in which production is the aim of man, and wealth the aim of production. In fact, however, when the narrow bourgeois form has been peeled away, what is wealth, if not the universality of needs, capacities, enjoyments, productive powers, etc., of individuals produced in universal exchange? What if not the full development of human control over the forces of nature, those of his own nature as well as those of so-called nature? What if not the absolute elaboration of his creative dispositions, without any preconditions other than antecedent historical evolution, which make the totality of this evolution, i.e. the evolution of all human powers as such, unmeasured by any previously established yardstick, an end in itself? What is this if not a situation where man does not reproduce in any determined form, but produces his totality, where he does not seek to remain something formed by the past, but is in the absolute movement of becoming? In bourgeois political economy, and in the epoch of production to which it corresponds, this complete elaboration of what lies within man appears as the total alienation and the destruction of all fixed, one-sided purposes, as the sacrifice of the end in itself to a wholly external compulsion. Hence, in one way, the childlike world of the ancients appears to be superior, and this is so, insofar as we seek for closed shape, form, and established limitation. The ancients provide a narrow satisfaction, whereas the modern world leaves us unsatisfied, or where it appears to be satisfied with itself is vulgar and mean. Okay, so bourgeois society. I'll stop here for questions or thoughts. We good? All right. Let's keep trucking then. I mean, what this this society of becoming and not being, right? A society built on labor. I mean, in a way, this is, because we were talking about this at coffee break the other day, right? It's hard to recognize ourselves in a kind of pre-bourgeois sociability, right? That someone would go around saying I didn't work for this, and therefore it's mine by right, is ridiculous to us, right? It's almost like a contradiction in terms. This is kind of, what we would recognize as a form of social relationships between human beings, which has emerged in this bourgeois society. Yeah.
I think the Marx quote sort of points towards this, but what do you make of the sort of apparent interests that people have today in sort of in the sense that they view this freedom of becoming as something that is denying for example the way in which humanity could have existed under traditional society? Maybe society should operate by like a large system of punishment and reward that simply is more or less divinely ordained. Or I think there are like some interest in that, but there's also maybe more plausible the sort of like interest in like returning to like this sort of communion with nature. So for taking that into account, like maybe not to elaborate on like what those mean about the present, but I'd be interested in sort of how, in what way could it be seen like as like childishness to sort of want those things, as Marx says, like.
Because there's a way in which it's like you don't want to be responsible for yourself, right? You know, if you were born into the world and you were told from birth, like, do you want to have a good life? Here's how you're going to do it, right? You're going to be a farmer, and you're going to grow beets, right? And you're going to do that for 60 years, and you're going to have, here are the holy days, right? Celebrate these holy days. Here's how you celebrate them, right? Do that for 60 years, and if you do that, without missing a beat, that's a good life. You've done it, right? This kind of bourgeois imagination of like constantly becoming and transforming yourself, where you're not given the goalpost at the beginning of life, but you have to figure out what it's going to be. You have to make it for yourself. I mean, it's terrifying, right? Like, of course, it's there's that childlike element in all of us that doesn't want to be free. Freedom tasks you, and you never can really be sure if you've lived up to the task of freedom, precisely because it's defined in an open-ended way.
When you mentioned the freedom as terrifying, and I thought of this when you brought up politics and becoming, but I forget the American revolutionary who says something to the effect of every generation should have to water its own tree of liberty with blood, paraphrasing.
Jefferson.
But it just reminds you of that quote, and how politics itself is also something that we can't really imagine, like pre-bourgeois society, the politics of like medieval society.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, like that's a kind of like wonderfully bourgeois image that Jefferson has, right? He says like no generation has a claim on the generation that follows it, right? Every generation has to like determine for themselves how they're going to live. And therefore, Jefferson's like, there should be a revolution every 25 years, right? New constitution should come out of it. Why should they have to listen to what we say, how we say they should live? I don't know, who would be up for a revolution every 25 years? It's kind of terrifying thought. All right, you would be, okay.
Yes.
We've got a true
believer in
revolutionary.
Change.
There you go. Someone knows their Trotsky. I mean, really, originally it's Marx. That's where Trotsky gets it.
The revolution in permanence. Actually, I think it's in the Marx that we'll read this semester.
Totally is. Are there any we don't have to have like brilliant thoughts either. If there's I used a word that didn't make sense, right? Is there anything I could explain better? I don't know. Those kind of questions are cool too. I don't take it for granted that these words are that we're fluent in this language of bourgeois sociability and becoming, not being, right? So I'm trying to recover something that's potentially obscure to us today in this teaching. So if it's obscure, that means I'm doing my job.
I have a question actually, that's pretty straightforward, I think, because I think I'm always confused by the terminology of being, and I guess in general I just have the question, what's so great about becoming, Like if there's,
Right.
just like a simple example, right? Assume there's like two states for me to exist, like state A and state B, and I can just oscillate between both states like really rapidly, I'm just like in maximal becoming mode, permanently changing, I don't
Sure.
know, from firefighter to philosophy professor, and back and forth. And that doesn't sound like a great idea, and I'm sure that nobody in the Marxist tradition would advise me to live like that as well. And so,
Right.
what's great about becoming? Because this seems like a counterexample.
I mean, I feel like, hiding behind this question, or at least hiding behind the answer I'm about to give to this question, is this this specter of teleology, right? In other words, like, is change just like random fluctuation that you're just like, in somewhere between, 0.2 and 1.3 seconds, I'm going to become a firefighter, and who knows exactly when, right? Or is there like a logic to it, right? There's like kind of, I'm becoming what I ought to be, right? There's like something in me now, like an incipient firefighter that's waiting to get out, right? And I'm like slowly, like coming to accord with that internal goal of my development, right? Because that's the bourgeois vision. It's not kind of random fluctuations, right? But it's becoming toward you are becoming what you ought to be, right? Bourgeois society sees itself this way, by the way. It's like all of this history, millennia of traditional civilization, has just been people like appropriating a surplus from labor, but not recognizing that they had a choice about how to do it because they were like trapped by civilization, or they're trapped by tradition. And bourgeois society is this kind of like dawning consciousness that like, no, we actually get to choose. Like, this is a choice we're making, what we do with this surplus. We could choose to do it differently. It sees itself as kind of the 10,000 years of human civilization has been leading up to this moment. And now the like true content of all human society has been revealed to us in this kind of like, urban bourgeois sociability founded on free labor.
I think I wanted to add something on how that sort of like teleological, like broad view of history, I think is reflected in the very like idea of like self-improvement, which is a very bourgeois concept. The idea that you can objectify yourself into something that you can say like, oh, like I have this specific part of myself, like I need to be better at graphic design, to tie it back to Neolithic art or Paleolithic art that hasn't changed in 15,000 years. Because when you brought up the example, I thought the more astounding thing would be not the equivalent of being able to reproduce it exactly, but going back to the temple and seeing like, oh, like 5,000 years ago, they're also making. Okay, someone just give me a random meme that's like on your mind. Okay, no one wants to do that.
The this is fine meme.
Sure.
Those me looking and judging the texture.
Sure, yeah. You go into an Egyptian temple and you see that on the wall, and you're like, how is it that nothing has changed? Like, it is. I think this is also something when it comes to art. Like, with art, I'm not much of an artist, but I think there is that sort of bourgeois like sentiment of when you do art, it isn't something where like as much as you're in actually like putting the brush to paper to paint something, you aren't sort of reproducing what is already in existence simply, but you're also, I think, coming to terms with what it means to depict it as such. So not only are you learning about what you're actually depicting, that you're sort of trying to depict it in like a way that is accurate to its nature and sort of working through that, you're also developing your own ability to depict that sort of nature. And I think that's a very modern concept. And it seems teleological because, for example, like you can say like, if you want to get better at something, practice. And I think that brings up like what you said, Philip, about like, what does it mean go from state A to state B? Like 0 paintings drawn to like 15,000. It isn't just in the replication of like images in reality, as most people in like Paleolithic society could do, but it also means that you're sort of developing your skills in some way, and you're changing the way in which you act. And so it seems to have like a purpose when you do art this way.
Yeah.
Yeah, on the point about teleology, I guess to return to Hegel for a bit, because I mean, sometimes his view, and I think perhaps Marx wants to take him to be sort of like the fullest realization of this kind of tendency in bourgeois philosophy. I mean, the way it's sometimes explained is like the acorn, the oak in the acorn, right? That it's already, it's purposed in the tree. But I mean, I don't know, and that's useful, I think, but in some ways maybe deforms like the logic that Hegel tries to give for teleological necessity. Like, I mean, for him, right, it's, the problem is that we're always trying to sort of be more ourselves, right? But there are very specific social conditions in which we can be ourselves, and that requires you to give reasons for your own sorts of, your self-becoming in ways that sort of loop other people into that self-becoming, right? To be more ourselves, I guess, in that way. It's like a co-constitutive process of coming to know. And I wonder about the inheritance of that kind of teleology, because, you know, this is a common, I think, problem, or this is seen as a problem for like the Marxian tradition of thought, right? Is that, okay, to what degree when we say, like, there's a practical necessity or logic to history, that this is a mechanistic vision, right? That there's like sort of things just kind of in a billiards ball fashion, things happen. It's like what is one damn thing after another, right? In kind of, and like, I guess, but to abandon that, right? To abandon sort of the idea that there is a practical necessity or logic to history that unfolds, even if we want to sort of, whether it be mechanistic or perhaps in this sort of Hegelian sense where it's like about learning to give or co-constituting the good life with each other, right? Without it, I mean, you lose sort of, I guess, the universal character of the Marxian tradition in the sense that there is a universal logic to history, one that can be shared with other people, that can sort of lead to emancipation for more than a particular subset of, like,
right.
You know, so I mean, I want to know about how you thread, how anyone here, I guess, threads this, because like I think there are good reasons why, like, people who are interested in history are no longer wedded to particular kinds of like mechanistic forms of, you know, historical necessity. But without it, it seems like there aren't lots of good reasons to have a concept of history that operates in anything much like the one we have now, right? Like in some ways it feels like there is, the ghost of teleology still haunts the historical discipline, even in sometimes unacknowledged or repressed ways. I'm curious to know what folks think.
No, I think this is a really good question, and I'm gonna try to get into this in the teaching, but maybe I'll just say, for Marx, there is a kind of a like necessary logic at work in history, and it's called capital. And the point of the revolution is to abolish it, right? So it's not like you know, there's a kind of logic that we're like you know, guarantees us success, right? And like the end point of this kind of teleological logic is like we win, right? But the logic that history has under capitalism is itself the function of the crisis of this society, right? And what it points to is not like positively like a new development that's you know, we win, right? But it points negatively to its own undermining and abolition, right? So it's a negative dialectic as opposed to a positive dialectic. But I'm interested if other people have thoughts on this question.
You know, there's in like post-colonial critique, you know, there's often people will make the argument that there's like, well, okay, well, if there wasn't sort of, even like this is the way I mean, most famously, I think in like the subaltern studies school, right? The way that the needle has been threaded, most famously by Dipesh Chakrabarty, is that like, okay, well, even if there was sort of, if it was a logic of the particular before, capital has universalized all things, right? Now a universal logic has unfolded. But I don't know if it's, like, I mean, it seems to me like that the Marxian tradition wants to make even like a broader claim than that, right? Because they're trying to say that there is like, again, like if we want to say that there's a category of traditional society writ large, right, that like can include things that are not just like the immediate predecessors to like capitalism, which is born in like, I guess we want to say like Netherlands and the UK, right, in this particular moment in history, that it's not just like its immediate predecessors that led up to it, but there was also a similar logic at play in like, you know, China or the Bengal or elsewhere that like maybe didn't reach its like fullest extent in this particular moment, but like there were incipient, like the logics of history prior to the moment of capital were also ones that were shared, right? There was sort of a universal at work in history before capitalism. I mean, I think even sort of the defenders of the particular will grant you that. They'll grant you like, okay, yes, now capitalism has come, it's made the world universal, now we can speak to each other history in sort of in the form that we're used to, in the form that the discipline is handed down to us, like from like 19th century German academics, is now at work. But like, I don't know if I don't want to seed the ground of like a universal logic to history ahead before the moment of capital, I think.
Yeah, no, maybe I'll read a little bit more and get more on the table, because I think we're building to this. I mean, I think this question is in the teaching.
I just wanted to say something, like, because of what you were saying. I tried to search, but I have no idea who the quote was actually from. It's easier to imagine the end of history than the end of capitalism.
Mark Fisher.
It was.
Yeah.
I would maybe, I guess speculatively say, like, how universal of a logic is at work in history? I mean, traditional civilization, which admittedly I'm painting with a broad brush there, right? But like, it spanned a millennia, right? It didn't seem like it was in any trouble, right? And it was overthrown by the unlikeliest people imaginable, right? These like escaped serfs from the Western European backwater, right? Like, no one would have predicted these are the people who are going to create some kind of epochal shift in human history. In the same way that, like, tens of thousands of years of the exact same cave paintings, right? And then one day, what's Rousseau's expression? Like, someone decides to, like, carve off some land and call it mine, right? Like, it didn't have to happen. Those cave paintings could have kept going on for, forever, perhaps, right? But, sadly, or fortunately or unfortunately, we're in history now, and so we have to deal with this kind of universal logic. Yeah, what's up?
A really brief comment, and to go back to something that you said, Blaine, earlier, which is that for these bourgeois philosophers to describe the world was not to be affirmative of it, but to critically sort of point towards, like, what would it mean that we can describe the world this way. I think that Hegel, following Rousseau, is using this to think about civilization. That it isn't that we know that civilization has led to something that we can call, like, the good, or whatever, for Hegel. But rather the task is of making good upon the fact that humanity has had to suffer under this process that we now can call civilization. That we can say that's something that we can sort of, not just politically, but in our social activity, live up to the fact that humanity has been under the rule of people who created art, the despots of society, for so long that now humanity can actually do something with that. And that this is the task rather than something that's inherently going to be like teleological. The telos is actually, I think, in that case, sort of a dare, like, can't you actually prove that this is why humanity exists? That we are supposed to be free?
You don't think that that it's a positive claim in Hegel?
I think it's a critical claim.
That's interesting. I'm not sure if I agree.
Yeah, I mean, we'll be reading these texts.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I like that expression of like it's a dare. I think that's a useful way of thinking about it.
So, I'm sorry, to elaborate, do you think that, like, not necessarily for Hegel, I would say for bourgeois philosophy more generally, I mean, so would you say that, like, the general impression that's, traditionally given about bourgeois philosophy, that sort of the past failures were necessary steps along a path of coming to know ourselves more deeply, and each failure giving us sort of like pointing the road to like a greater self-knowledge. But that's like, I mean, that's progressive in a way that I think you're trying to step away from. Is that correct?
I don't think, I think that, for example, Blaine was talking about Adam Smith, who I think we'll be reading. Adam Smith was not writing, oh, here are the facts of bourgeois society, by the way, don't you remember you live in this? It was, I mean, this is very clear in the second half of The Wealth of Nations, but it's an appeal to, like, how come, like, the English colonies are a better place to live than the Spanish colonies? How come you don't have mass slavery in, like, Pennsylvania? Aside from, like, the traffic in, like, African slaves, which is still different in England. But the point there would not be to say, like, it would be to say, okay, this was actually a condition that we can learn something from. That, for example, this points to the fact that the mercantilists in England, the ones who are running the parliament, are actually stopping the development of human progress. That it's actually, in that way, a political text. And back to when you brought up, like, history, like, seems to just be one damn thing after another. I think that's, do you know the author, One Damn Thing After Another? Maybe I'll go to Adorno, who says that the history just seems to be in his present, in the 1940s after World War II. And, of course, we're not even getting there in this teaching. But the present just seems to be like the history of like various gang wars and rackets to gain like wealth over people and dominance over people. But in that case, I think Adorno is embodying that critical spirit where it isn't that like this is the case. It isn't a nihilistic statement. At least simplistically, it isn't a call to be nihilistic about the present, but an indication of without any actual attempt to overcome that classification of the present, practically speaking, however that occurs, then the future of humanity is just going to be what it looks like today, which is terrible. That it's sort of, it's a dare. I think I was right to use that word. Like,
it's interesting that you bring up Adorno because, I mean, in Negative Dialectics, I mean, he explicitly says this, like, self-consciousness could have happened at any point, which is, but I think traditionally that's read as like a break, right, that's read as a break from Hegel, a break from Marx, even, right? That this is a thing, that this coming to know ourselves in this sort of particular guise, right, is that could have happened at any point along the path or trajectory. I think I don't know if that's true, but that's like generally read as something distinct about Adorno and like him like setting aside a tradition of thinking about historical necessity, and maybe that's not the case.
I think you also have to contextualize that not only is he following Walter Benjamin and like the theses on the philosophy of history, but I think that it's also overlooked that the Enlightenment itself appears to have its own critical thinkers that are like skeptical of the Enlightenment in some way, but actually that this skepticism is actually the Enlightenment sort of applied to itself. Of course, it's different, and Blaine will get into this when we actually get to how our when we talk about capital and capitalism. Why aren't we all like thinking about Adam Smith? Why aren't like the people talking about capital Adam Smith people?
I think this is like a question worth leaving open, actually. Right? There's this question, about a kind of, I guess, like universality and contingency in history, right? On the one hand, if we say that, we're dealing with kind of a contingent historical task, then it seems like, okay, is it just random fluctuations, right? Like Philip was saying, right? Like I just happen to think that it would be better if we did, something else other than bourgeois society, so let's try to do that, versus a kind of like universality where, like, this vector there is, okay, am I just going to end up affirming the thing that I'm trying to overcome by saying, like, well, it was all baked in from the beginning anyway, right? Even the I don't know, the Boer War or something was like, like had a kernel of freedom inside of it that we have to get behind. I mean, Marxism is in danger of like falling into either of these problems, right? And then Marxism become, I mean, we'll get to that, but I think this is a question worth leaving open. It's a good question. So let me skip ahead. Right? We're talking about bourgeois society, right? In the aftermath of the French Revolution, and with the development of industrial production, first in Britain and then spreading throughout the world, bourgeois society enters a profound crisis. So after the Napoleonic Wars, there's this commercial crisis, right, when all of the trade starts to flow again because Napoleon's continental system ends, and all of a sudden there's like too much stuff, right? There's just like all of these useful manufactures coming out of England that are like sitting on docks with no one to buy them. Like, shirts are rotting away and so on. What's going on? Right? What does it mean to have like too much of a useful thing? To defend its workers in industry, the fledgling American Republic throws up a tariff wall to protect itself that won't come down until after World War II. And by the mid-19th century, all of Europe is following their example, right? So we're all now like economically like at war with each other. We're saying like, no, you can't sell your goods to me. I won't let you sell to me, right? And I'm doing this to defend labor, right? To make sure that people, in Germany have jobs that aren't eliminated by all of the British, cheap British manufacturers that are flooding the market, right? So in order to defend labor, we have to violate the Smithian idea that we're all like, freely and pacifically cooperating with each other through commercial exchange. Political economy is divided on how to make sense of this crisis. So Sismondi calls this a crisis of overproduction. British society has produced too much of a useful thing, and society can't afford its own products. So overproduction, underconsumption. We're not consuming enough. The solution for Sismondi is to shift wealth from the capitalists who save more to the workers who spend more, right? And then the workers will afford to, as it were, metabolize all of this product that we've produced. Jean-Baptiste Say, another political economist, says, well, hold on, it doesn't make any sense to say that you can have overproduction of a particular good, because some other good is you haven't produced enough of, but you can't have overproduction of everything all at once. If people can't afford these goods, it's because they have nothing that they made that they can exchange for them. And so the solution is people need to be making more, which means they need more capital. So it's exactly the opposite prescription, right? We need to consume less, we need to save more, so we have more capital, and we can produce our way out of this dilemma. Right? They're both making their stand on Adam Smith, right? But Adam Smith seems to be saying, on the one hand, save more, consume less. On the other hand, save less, consume more. During the crisis, workers are thrown out of work. And even when the economy recovers, the unemployed remain. Unemployment has become a permanent feature of Western European society. The social question is raised. What to do with the laboring poor who've appeared in every corner of Western Europe? Laboring poor. This is a contradiction in terms, according to Locke, right? What does it mean to say that someone has no property except for the source of all property, labor, right? Doesn't make sense. Doesn't compute. Ricardo explains, is another political economist, explains labor is a commodity like any other, and therefore its natural price is the labor which is required to produce it. Okay, so what the worker is owed naturally is a wage that allows him to reproduce himself, buy food and shelter and so on, and feed his family that he needs. Everything above that is the natural price of capital, because after all, how would you ever produce something in excess of your own subsistence if you hadn't had these cool tools and machines and so on to do? Okay, and this is proven by Smith's theory because of the labor theory of value, right? So the value of me as a worker, my capacity to work, is the amount of labor it takes to get me to work tomorrow, and so on and so forth. The socialist Thomas Hodgkin also takes his hand on Adam Smith, but to refute Ricardo. Hodgkin says, after all, capital is nothing but labor, according to Smith. Capital is just the accumulated knowledge and skill of the workers of a nation, together with their mutual confidence in each other. The proof that the machine has no value is that as soon as one worker is done making it, and another worker has not yet stepped in to use it, the machine is sitting there and it's losing value. It's rotting away, right? So the machine in and of itself, without labor, has no value at all. And therefore, Hodgkin has this funny expression, like the road maker can share profits with the road user, but the road cannot do so. Right? The road is owed nothing. Only the workers who make and use the road are owed anything. For this reason, Hodgkin says it's a nonsense to imagine that the capitalists could export their capital. What would they be exporting? They'd be exporting like the historically developed skill of their own workers. Can't do that, right? The unfinished business of the revolution hangs over Europe like, dare I say it, a specter. Yet the problem seems to acquire a new, more torturous character. In France, even the overthrow of the Bourbons and the installation of a constitutional monarchy after the British example does not seem to resolve the social question. Right? So it's like, okay, we did it. We succeeded. We established a liberal democratic republic, but the problem remains. New words arise, reflecting attempts to deal with the new problem: liberalism, socialism, and sociology. So it's like, okay, there's this thing, society, and we need to understand its laws better if we're gonna make this project work. I'm gonna skip the whirlwind tour of early 19th century radical ideology, but yeah, it's crazy. It's good, cool stuff happens, right? There's all these debates about like, are we completing the French Revolution, or are we going beyond the French Revolution? Right? Maybe the French Revolution was somehow limited or backwards or a mistake, right? Are we realizing, Adam Smith's bourgeois sociability of labor? Or are we, as the socialist Robert Owen puts it, labor is just a machine like any other, and like all the machines in my factory. Robert Owen's he's like a factory owner who organizes this like interesting communal experiment in his factory town, right? And he's like, look, factory owner, you perfect all the machines in your factory, right? Well, what about the labor machine? Can't that be perfected through education, right? So it's like, okay, labor has become a kind of machine that we're going to perfect. And so on and so on. Democracy, right? Is democracy the return of like ancient freedom, right? Every citizen gets to participate in the state's right of life and the state's power over the life and death of its members, right? Or is it about freedom from the state, right? So anarchism, right? Are we going to abolish the state? Or are we going to, live in freedom in society with each other? All of this stuff is coming up. What, if anything, does Marxism have to add to any of these debates? Well, we could do worse than to ask Marx himself. So I'm going to read two things of Marx. The first is a kind of longer passage from, as it were, the beginning of Marx's career, 1843. And then the second is a short thing from, I think, the later 60s, which is Marx, reflecting on, what does he have to add? Okay, so here's the first one. If the designing of the future and the proclamation of ready-made solutions for all time is not our affair, then we realize all the more clearly what we have to accomplish in the present. I am speaking of a ruthless criticism of everything existing. Ruthless in two senses. The criticism must not be afraid of its own conclusions, nor of conflict with the powers that be. I am therefore not in favor of setting up any dogmatic flag. On the contrary, we must try to help the dogmatics to clarify to themselves the meaning of their own positions. Thus, communism, to be specific, is a dogmatic abstraction. Not any imagined possible communism, but actually existing communism in the form preached by Cabet, des Amis, Weitling, etc. This communism is only a special manifestation of the humanistic principle, which is still infected by its opposite, private being. Elimination of private property is therefore by no means identical with this communism, and it is not accidental but quite inevitable that communism has seen other socialist teachings arise in opposition to it, such as the teachings of Fourier, Proudhon, etc. Thanks for coming.
Sorry, I have to catch a bus.
Yep.
I got like an hour transit. Have a good night, everyone.
Not accidental, but inevitable that other socialist teachings have arisen in opposition to socialism, such as the teachings of Fourier, Proudhon, etc. Because it is itself only a special, one-sided realization of the socialist principle. We shall confront the world not as doctrinaires with a new principle. We will only show the world what it is fighting for. Then it will transpire that the world has long been dreaming of something that it can acquire if only it becomes conscious of it. It will transpire that it is not a matter of drawing a great dividing line between past and future, but of carrying out the thoughts of the past. And finally, it will transpire that mankind begins no new work, but consciously accomplishes its old work. Right, I want to underline that last line, right? Mankind begins no new work, but consciously accomplishes its old work. Okay, so that's the first passage. And the second, and now as to myself, no credit is due to me for discovering the existence of classes in modern society or the struggle between them. Long before me, bourgeois historians have described the historical development of this class struggle, and bourgeois economists the economic anatomy of the classes. What I did that was new was to prove, 1, that the existence of classes is only bound up with particular historical phases in the development of production. 2, that the class struggle necessarily leads to the dictatorship of the proletariat. 3, that this dictatorship itself only constitutes the transition to the abolition of all classes and to a classless society. And so, I'm already over time, and so to try to make a longer story much shorter, right? Marx is describing, in the first passage he's describing his method, right? He's saying, okay, this is going to be an immanent dialectical critique, right? Immanent, right, from within. So we're going to operate within socialism. We're not going to wave a dogmatic banner in its face, like here's the truth, right? We have it. We're going to operate within what the socialists are saying. Dialectic, meaning we're going to proceed according to the self-contradiction, right, of this object which we're internal to. And critique in the kind of Kantian Hegelian sense of not like, I critiqued you so you're wrong, right, I gotcha. But critique in the sense of demonstrating that the thing contains within itself possibilities for further development. I was talking about this earlier when I said, like, for bourgeois thought, giving an account of something means like giving a critique of it. It's in that same sense, right? And Marx's object is socialism. So putting all of that together, right? Marx is going to, from within socialism, right? Demonstrate the self-contradiction of socialism, in order to, by taking socialism as a necessary but not accidental, necessary, not accidental expression of the society which has given rise to it, of capitalism. He's going to use this critique of socialism to indicate that capitalism is itself a transitional form of society, right? That capitalism is not like, it's not as though capitalism is like a thing which has like laws, that like is self-contained and it doesn't work, right? But capitalism is just what has become of bourgeois society when it has become self-contradictory because it's failed to transition into something beyond itself, right? Which is what Marx is trying to indicate a political possibility for. And so there's the immanent dialectical critique. And politically, right, what is Marx's prescription for how we do this? The dictatorship of the proletariat. In other words, the proletariat is going to self-consciously complete the old work of bourgeois society. The proletariat is going to, what are they demanding? They're demanding the right to work, right? They're demanding a fair pay for a fair day's work. They're demanding that the workers should be in charge of the government. These are all bourgeois ideas, right? This is all like French Revolution stuff. This is Adam Smith, right? The workers are demanding the realization of bourgeois society. But in demanding it, they're making that bourgeois society self-contradictory, right? So the workers demanding the right to work, it looks to the people of France like the barbarians are coming and they're going to tear down civilization, right? Please, General Cavaignac, save us from these barbarians, right? This is what's happening in France. So Marx takes that seriously. When the workers demand the realization of bourgeois society, it looks like that society is becoming self-contradictory. It's undermining itself. That it's like seemingly demanding both the impossible and the opposite of the impossible, right? Demanding democracy and anarchy. It's demanding the completion of the bourgeois revolution and that we supersede the bourgeois revolution. What we are dealing with in capitalism, this is the conclusion, what we are dealing with in capitalism, according to Marx, is a transition pathology. It is the immanent logic of a crisis of bourgeois society, pointing beyond itself, that produces the proletariat, socialism, and indeed Marxism. Marxism purports to be scientific, i.e. aware of its own conditions of possibility, but its conditions of possibility are capitalism. And Marxism is tasked with abolishing capitalism. But this means that Marxism is tasked to abolish itself. Marxism today has failed to hold on to its critical content, indeed to its self-critical content, becoming science, i.e. immutable universal truth, right? So not science in the sense that Marx meant it, like knowledge aware of its own preconditions, but science in the sense of laws which are always true. Whether this takes the form of an economic theory or an organizational tactic or both. But this means that the possibilities for transformation that Marx sought to keep on the political agenda have become deeply obscured. What has become of socialism, that tattered red flag we have inherited from the 19th century? Is it a demonstrably superior method of production that has been or waits to be partially or fully put into practice in some enlightened corner of the world? Is it a dream that burns in the heart of every true revolutionary, an infinite task, never finally to be achieved, but always urging us to take the next step onward? Is it an inevitable consequence of the collapse of capitalism? And if so, how many more centuries do we still have to wait for the inevitable? If it is true, as some of my friends on the left like to remind me, that the fate of humanity hangs in the balance, whether due to global warming, nuclear war, worldwide fascist revanchism, or our new AI overlords, then perhaps the urgent task remains, for us as for Max Horkheimer almost a century ago, the Marxist clarification of the concept of freedom. Yeah, that's my teaching. Questions? No questions? That all went down easy. Ben?
So you talked about Marx as providing an immanent critique of socialism. Maybe this is an overly vague question, but do you think that that's... Actually, there's two questions. One, do you think that that is, like, in some way superior or more useful to simply, I guess, describing either your own kind of socialism or, like, having, like, at least, like, just a broad list of, like, preconditions that have to be met while leaving specific possibilities open? And two, do you think that that's something that is either is being done today or needs to be done?
Well, I'll answer the second question first because it's
Okay.
easier.
Yeah.
Yeah, certainly. I do think. I mean, this is, in a sense, the authorization for Platypus as a project.
Yeah, that's
right. Why are we on campuses? Why are we trying to host the conversation on the left? We do, think that. I mean, this is a necessary but not a sufficient condition, right? That the left needs to have a kind of critical self-consciousness. If it's really going to own up to its task, which is like the transformation of world history, right? Like Marx thought that the political task that was before, the working class socialists through like the Chartists in England, right? The task that was before the proletariat, which was politically organizing itself in order to demand bourgeois rights. Marx thought the task that was before them was like a transformation of society more profound than the emergence of bourgeois society from traditional civilization, something more on a par with that revolution, right? The Neolithic revolution. Marx thought that was like the immediate political question that had to be answered at his time. If that kind of left, right, is going to exist again, I think it needs that kind of critical self-consciousness. So then to get to your first question, like why is that? Why would that be a useful thing to have as opposed to like just a really good description of what socialism is? I think, one thing I might say is, of course, Marx wouldn't have needed to invent a really good description of socialism because there were already so many, and they're all wonderful, right? Like, if I'd highly encourage everyone in this room to go out and read Charles Fourier. He's an absolute delight, right? And he has all of these. I'll give you a sample, right? Fourier is like, parents naturally want to spoil their children, right? They want their children to feel great about themselves and feel like you're so smart, you're so handsome, and right, but they feel like they have to hold back because you don't want to like your kid to get a big head, or right, you want your kid to like grow up to be a responsible member of society. And Fourier is like, that's bunk. We should be unleashing, right, every parent's desire to spoil their children. They should be spoiling them 110%, and that's okay because society produces other forces which are capable of kind of like checking a kid's ego and making them grow up into responsible adults, and those are called bullies, right? The other children, right? They're gonna like, and so the child goes to school and he's like, all the other kids are like, ah ha ha, you don't know how to spell, like don't you suck? And then he goes back home and, his mom and dad are like, don't worry, you're such a genius even though you can't spell, and you're gonna figure it out, right? And that's how this kid is going to grow. In Fourier's socialist utopia, right? That's how members of society are going to be fashioned. I don't know. I just think that's lovely, right? I don't have any beef with Fourier. I think like that his socialist utopian vision is worth fighting for, 100%, right? No notes. But the issue is. Why is it that I feel the same way about Robert Owen, saying like we're going to perfect like our human material, right? Like the human material is infinitely perfectible if only we, can subject it to a good scientific analysis. And I feel this way about all the other socialists as well, right? So Marx is trying to say there's something inadequate about all of these utopian visions, wonderful though they each are, and that inadequacy is not accidental but necessary. Right? That by saying, like, why would it be the case that we are necessarily producing these conflicting and competing visions of what it would mean to unleash bourgeois sociability, right? And that's a way of grasping negatively, right? Of, as it were, feeling the contours of the need to go beyond bourgeois sociability. Which is something, maybe this is a better answer to your question. Ultimately, all of the utopian socialists are just describing a demand for the realization of bourgeois society. And they can't describe anything else. because we're all hopelessly bourgeois, right? We're all totally, you know, we've been born into this bourgeois society. We can't help it, even if we'd rather not. We can't help but be bourgeois, and that's true of all of the socialists. Marx thinks that the political task is something beyond the fulfillment of that kind of like natural demand we all have for bourgeois sociability, but it's something that you can only grasp negatively, right? That you're like not capable of writing the poetry of the future yet. You're not free enough to write the poetry of the future, right? And so the only way we're going to get there is the only way we're even going to recognize the necessity of this transformation is through the critique of what socialism is providing us, as opposed to giving a competing positive vision. And does that speak to your question?
I think so. I would have I have a follow-up, but I want other people to have a chance to answer. So I feel like I've asked like 2/3 of the questions so far. So
good questions, though.
I guess I want to ask about, on that, to continue the conversation now that, like, since it's more free flowing, I guess.
I don't like being all the way over here. Speed. We can be more intimate.
Speaking about the utopians, and maybe this is sort of, but it's like, again, like the problem of the utopians is not even past, right? There's, famously people will say, there's that line from Engels where he says, like, when someone tried to talk to Marx about morality, he would laugh right in their face. And like, there's something about these utopian socialists that's like, and I think it's, like you said, it's because it's ultimately a demand. And this is true even, I think, of the most radical of them, like, Proudhon, right? Sort of like the anarchist father, right? He's saying that, like, ultimately what he wants is a realization or fulfillment of, the bourgeois promise, right?
Mm-hmm.
And because
does he say there's, like, 3 books that he couldn't do without? The Bible, The Wealth of Nations. What's the third one? Is it Hegel?
Marx or Proudhon?
Proudhon.
I don't know the word.
I forget the third one, but one of them is Adam Smith, right? Yeah.
And, I don't know, I'm interested in the fact that they share, the utopians often do, right, like this moral register for their claims, right? They make it in terms of, the rightness or goodness of a particular kind of, like, living together or being together, and, while Marx, I think, makes ethical claims, that's different. I don't think that the argument is addressed on sort of a moral horizon in a way that's interesting to me, because I think a lot of descendant, traditions, Marxists today, do operate on sort of moral grounds, right? Like they make their claim, they address their claims to like, well, we should alleviate poverty because of the wrongness, or like they'll say, look at the evil of this capitalist, right? He's like a fucked up guy, he's like taking money from people. Right. And this is not like the traditional Marxian register, right? Like this is not sort of, and I wonder the degree to which our desire for, and I mean this generally, if you guys have a thought on this, I wonder the degree to which our desire for like redressing our claims like morally, right, on moral grounds, like impedes the vision. And I mean particularly like that, like the idea that there's like an evil capitalist, like as like a moral problem, right, as like a sort of a devil in some kind of way, as opposed to like capital being, a worker's like, own labor, sort of like alienated labor confronting them in some sort of way. I mean, to what degree do you see that as a problem? And like why, if it is indeed, if you do agree that perhaps that there's a way in which like modern Marxisms are moral in the way that like pre-Marxian, like pre-critical, if we want to say, socialists were moral, like why is that the case, and like what do we do about it?
I appreciate this was a question for everyone, but I just, one thought I want to throw out there. the idea that like the capitalists are these kind of like evil, they're like greedy or they're like cruel or they don't care about us. That is a bourgeois cry of protest, right? And do you guys know about this this conspiracy of equals in the French Revolution? Right?
Is that Babouf?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Right. It's an exciting story that Babouf is this kind of Jacobin after the Jacobins are overthrown in the French Revolution, and he's like planning this insurrection to overthrow the reactionary Directory and put Jacobins back in power, and oh, by the way, abolish private property in France, right? And Filippo Buonarroti, who's both a participant in and a historian of this event, explains like why the need to abolish private property, and the way he puts it is he draws on Adam Smith's story of how feudalism collapsed. He's like, okay, the aristocrats, they like traded away all of their wealth to these like urban merchants who sold them buckles, right? But now the urban merchants have all of the aristocrats' wealth, and therefore they have all of the power the aristocrats had to command other men, right? So they've, as it were, like inherited the kind of aristocratic privilege from the old aristocracy. And therefore there can never truly be democracy in France until we appropriate these merchants of all of their wealth, right? So it's like literally just like word for word, it's like, what do we need to do? We need to repeat the overthrow of the aristocracy, right? And that's what the abolition of the wealth of the, he would of course call them capitalists, but these kind of, the shopocrats, that's what he calls them, right? The shopocrats. Right? So it's like, it's just totally a bourgeois idea, right? Like the aristocrats, the shopocrats, they hate us, they're stealing from us, they're cruel and greedy, and we have to overthrow them.
I guess I just wanted less to answer your question because I think I'm not qualified enough for that. That was well, that's fair, but still, it was a lot. So I was just stuck on a particular word as well. You mentioned like the evil capitalist, and I'm more curious to like hear your opinion on this comment I was thinking of. Is there even an evil capitalist? Is the capitalist the evil one, or is the system that shaped them into that position? Would any of us be better placed into those circumstances, that position? Would our morality, so to speak, be able to overcome that?
No, yeah, I don't agree. Yeah, I agree. I don't think that the problem at hand is one of sort of finding the right kinds of guys to be at the head of society, right? And I mean, like, even if, like, I don't know, if I had a button that I could press and I could turn, I don't know, Elon Musk into like, I could put a copy of myself into Elon Musk's brain. I don't know how much I could do, right? Even if I was like a committed Marxist in some kind of way and a rich guy, an extremely rich guy, there probably isn't actually that much I could do. And I mean, again, because I'm not, well, I mean, if you're a Marxist, that's for other reasons, right? Because, you're not, like, there are like the working classes, like the subject-object of history, right, as Lukács would say. But, like, yeah, I think you're entirely right. At least that's my opinion on it. But it seems like even people who, like, believe this on some level or another, it's very hard, and I feel this myself. I don't know about you guys. I often find myself slipping into, like, moral registers for, like, when I want to, like, have conversations with people about, like, why we should do a particular thing. I'm, like, addressing it on the level of, like, okay, well, isn't this a fucked up thing this guy is doing, or whatever, right? And perhaps that's just, the nature of conversation in that way. But, like, yeah, I don't know. It feels to me like it's not living up, perhaps, to the potential of the criticism, right? And, it's like it's not, I don't know if it's always as effective. I mean, I think there's a time and place maybe for moral claims along these lines. But I'm not sure that they're always the most clarifying. I don't know.
I think it's a similar situation to like our use of labels in society. Oftentimes it's like explicitly negative, but at the same time it's very difficult to get rid of them because they do play a central role in how we communicate with each other or how we even observe the world around us. So I guess it's a matter of, even if that moral judgment may not be the best way to look at it, it's kind of difficult to have a proper conversation without that context to ground the whole conversation into reality.
I think maybe the thing that I'd say is the reason. So something I think to keep in mind when talking about these things, when talking about like the evil capitalist, because this was common rhetoric not only for the utopian socialists, but for the organized working class under these Marxist parties in the late 20th century, that like you could say like, oh, like these goddamn capitalists are just trying to conspire to like put us down. I think the reason, the necessity for that as a category comes from the fact that there actually was a choice that you could make, that there was an alternative to the system. I'm thinking particularly of like in the social democratic parties that we'll see this semester that Engels is writing to, especially in Germany, that there was a choice that you could make to mark your break with the existing system, as much as you were still part of it. That would be to join the mass working class party. So when there's this moral indignation that goes to like, why aren't these capitalists like just giving up? And like, I think the reason why it appears that way is just like sort of like they should be ashamed of themselves, is actually something that's very contemporary and isn't just the utopian socialists, because there is not really something you can gesture to and be like, this is concretely the path forward for like liberation beyond capitalism. So in that sense, like if we're trying to sort of take to heart that like and I think this is tied to the Marx quote from these are these selections in the Marx Engels reader, I forget their names, but how communism is infected by its opposite in bourgeois property.
The letter to Ruga.
Yeah, the letter to Ruga. I think that's a very particular way, and maybe I'm sort of looping this back into, Ben, your question earlier about what does it mean to have like an affirmative versus like imminent dialectical critique of these things. I think part of it is to demonstrate the ability to actually overcome them. And so in the absence of being able to overcome them in the present, calling someone like an evil capitalist seems almost like comical, instead of an actual call to like change the world as it would have been seen.
So it's like vestigial now. It's like sort of, it may have served the purpose at one point, but now it is actually like the utopians, and it's sort of like stripped of meaning. Is that fair? Is that a fair
so I'm not even sure if it was stripped of meanings for the utopians, because they were the socialist movement of their time, and actually they clarified. Maybe due to Marx, we'll see. I think he makes some. I think we can see historically the effect of Marxist thought on the left and socialism to actually clarify itself beyond that moral critique. But even before then, there was actually something to socialism that isn't there now. And I don't think it's purely vestigial in the sense that, like, if it's vestigial, it would be in the sense that the bourgeois thinkers would think about evolution, which is that maybe the appendix, which is like the example of the useless, this vestigial part of the human body, will evolve into something that actually has a purpose to it. So, I mean, I think that is how I think about it. If we're thinking about especially how Platypus would take up that project of critique that Marx inaugurated, it would also not be possible to simply reject out of hand, I think. That's sort of like the basic antinomy of like, oh, I don't want to be a capitalist. The capitalists are all scum. It would be to sort of see like, why is that expressed?
Okay, thank you.
Other thoughts? I know, Ben, you still have a question in the chamber.
I guess I'm kind of trying to find a sort of middle way between like this sort of critique without a positive vision, and the sort of like hyper-specific positive visions that, you know, each of the individual early socialists fought for that are, you know, possibly contradictory. I guess, would there be some value in, you know, I guess kind of defining socialism not in super specific terms, but in like, I guess, what is the minimum requirement for a system to be socialist? You know, like is there value in that, or is that still like too utopian or whatever?
Can I want to take a stab at answering that question, but first I'm curious, like, what do you think are the stakes of giving a minimal account of socialism? Like, why would it be a mistake if we were unable to do that?
I think that without a clear understanding of what you're fighting for, it's very, very easy to, I guess, either devolve into, you know, splits that could have been avoided had people with incompatible goals simply not worked together in the first place, or alternatively, I guess, if you don't have a minimal understanding of what you are trying to fight for, it's very easy to sort of just kind of stumble forward blindly and, you know, see socialism as this sort of distant promised land in the future that, you know, what you're doing in the present will just sort of somehow lead to it by magic, even if what you're doing is not that different from capitalism.
I think, and this might be an interesting question for other people to weigh in on as well, but in terms of a kind of minimal definition of socialism, I would maybe just stick to a negative formulation. In other words, what is socialism? Well, it's not capitalism. Nor is it some kind of like romantic return to a society that was before capitalism. It's a society that isn't founded on private property, isn't founded on, wonderful though they are, right, the kind of bourgeois sociability founded in free labor. You know, indeed, a society without labor as we would define it at all, right? No private property, no labor, no bourgeois social relations, no state, right? All of these artifacts of our prehistorical condition, right? It's none of those. Maybe that could serve as a kind of minimal definition.
Even if that's the case for example, this group here, for us, do you think that's enough to actually like inform other people, to inform others, to convince them to follow something so different from the norm, something so alien or even outright like something they fear? If we're trying to basically convince people to follow an ideology different from that which they've been taught, just giving them a simple definition is sometimes the first step in being able to connect with them. And even if it's playing by the capitalist rules, it's kind of hard not to, if you're actually trying to not only convince people but change the rules of the game itself.
Yeah, this is a good question. And, you know, in a way, Marx didn't have this problem. He, as it were, sidestepped the problem. Because Marx was not, and he kind of says this in the passage from the longer passage from the letter to Ruge I read. He's like, look, we're not here to like shout the slogan of the true struggle at people, right? We're not going to raise a dogmatic banner. We're not trying to like rally people to like fight for socialism, but we're instead, you know, explaining to the world what it is really fighting for. That's how Marx puts it. And, you know, more specifically, what's endlessly inspiring to Marx and Engels is the Chartist movement in Britain in the 40s, which is British workers organizing themselves in order to make this petition to Parliament for, they call it the People's Charter. It's basically a demand for universal male suffrage democracy, right? Like, everyone can vote and secret ballot and elections every year and two other conditions, I forget. In other words, they're not demanding socialism, right? They're not demanding all the crazy stuff that I just said, like no private property, no state, blah, blah, blah. They're demanding democracy. And yet, for Marx and Engels, when the workers organized themselves politically to demand even something as simple as just straight up bourgeois democracy, it points beyond itself, right? In other words, like subjectively, they're just demanding bourgeois rights. But objectively, they can't stand pat in a kind of like neo-Jacobin, like we're going to do the revolution again, right? They're going to be forced to outstrip themselves in practice because it's the workers who are organizing themselves to do it. This is Marx and Engels' idea. Lenin calls this the who-whom question, meaning like not like what are we going to do, like what policies are we going to implement or something like that, but who is going to implement them? That's the crucial question. The reason I say all this is because for Marx and Engels, the workers you didn't need to convince them to demand socialism. You just had to critically work within what they were already demanding, which was just straight up bourgeois democratic rights, period, right? But this kind of, critical self-consciousness of that demand when the workers pointed towards something more.
But we are sorry.
Go ahead. No.
But we already have more or less our bourgeois democratic rights. Obviously, some new, more or less, like in the sense that you can't just have a workers' movement demanding universal male suffrage because there's already, with the exception of people who've been convicted of felonies, and even not even that in some states, there's already universal male suffrage. My point is, I guess, if you're making a demand for, whether it's the worker making the demand or someone else, if what they're demanding can theoretically be achieved under capitalism, then the capitalists will sooner do that than, fall and, I guess my point is the modern capitalist state has a vastly superior either willingness or ability to recuperate social movements compared to the states of the 19th century.
I want to add on to what he was saying. In a very similar light, not only can they take in these movements and adapt them to capitalism, it's also a matter that even the movements which should not be adaptable, which should not be part of this umbrella, can oftentimes be turned against themselves. Or I guess what I'm really trying to make reference to is the way they can be convinced that, for example, socialists are fighting against them, against these rights, against these basic things they are demanding, and be convinced that the capitalist or the bourgeois or whoever is in power is actively actually fighting for them, and they are the ones in the right, and it's these other people fighting against what they need. If it's so easy, especially now with technology and information, to convince someone of a lie, to convince them of something that is just straight up not true, then how do you reconcile that with just leaving it up to the workers? Or if the workers can be convinced that their own movement is actually supported by the capitalists, then why would they fight against them?
No, I mean, this is a good question. In a way, it's like, well, maybe I would just say this. The Marxist political strategy, in other words, yes, there needs to be some notion that what we're demanding is unco-optable. It's really not capitalism. It's one of the virtues of the negative definition of socialism, right? The Marxist political strategy was, okay, we're going to have working class socialist parties, right? Meaning, the workers are organizing themselves politically to demand what they demand, which is always going to be a demand for bourgeois society. That's just always what the workers are going to demand. But when they organize themselves in the form of a socialist party to get those bourgeois demands, then there is this kind of consciousness of a task that goes beyond whatever the immediate, bourgeois demands might be. So it's a proletarian party and it's a socialist party. It's a proletarian socialist party. Both elements, both ingredients of that recipe were crucial for Marxism. But I don't know. It seems like, is there maybe a need for? Are you saying there's a need for like a fuller articulation of what socialism is, or like a fuller argument in favor of socialism?
I guess further than that, there's a need to reinforce its principles when not only are they constantly under attack, but moreover, it's also a matter of for example, fake news. Fake news are such a big factor nowadays that in this way of sharing information, the truth gets lost along the way, and it's kind of hard to really say who is acting against them. It's the same basic idea that the workers are being turned against themselves from early socialism, just put into a new situation through the information age.
Yeah, maybe I would say, like, yeah, there's a kind of a basic failure just to even like understand what's going on around you, right? This is what like fake news speaks to, right? It's like, okay, I recognize that every time I turn on the news or every time I open a newspaper, I'm just getting ideology, right? I'm just getting some kind of ideological expression of not things as they really are, but how it would be convenient for me to think they are, or something like that. How would a socialist movement potentially cut against that? One way is that you would actually like learn certain things in practice, which you can't learn by reading a newspaper. Like when the workers are like trying to organize themselves politically, they're going to encounter certain obstacles, right? Why is it that my coworker like still thinks that if he votes for the Democrats, that's going to be what improves the situation or something? Why isn't he willing to join me in my like crazy ambitious socialist political project? You're kind of like learning about the world actually by trying to organize it, by trying to intervene in it practically, in a way that you can't learn about it from a newspaper, which is again, as it were, an argument for like letting the bourgeois ideology of the workers cook, as opposed to like trying to correct it, right? Because it's like, okay, but in like when they don't just like sit on their couch and demand bourgeois society, but organize in order to reach these demands, then that makes it possible to learn something about the world they live in.
I wonder if, and this is just an idea, to what extent the ability or desire for socialist mass parties, particularly at like the turn of the century or like just before then, to like create a world or a set of social relations in miniature, right? In the sense that I could be a socialist and like go to socialist functions and have a socialist wedding and have there's like socialist like youth groups or like a socialist, I don't know, any number of things, right? And I mean this is true about I guess maybe bourgeois democratic parties as well at one point, that like the Republican Party used to have like the Free Soilers used to have like all these like social apparatuses that were contained under their flag in some way, right? And I don't know, I mean, the demand for dual power is talked about a lot, and like the idea that like sort of you have to build the new world in the shell of the old, as it were. But like, I mean, a co-optable party to me, I mean, it's not like the SPD wasn't co-opted at some point, but I think it's like it's harder to do when they aren't like sort of these hollowed out, like, voting blocks, as opposed to like a mass party that has sort of a social world associated with it, right? Like what it meant to be a socialist was that you had like sort of, and not just narrowly in like the way that like, the CPUSA had like some clubs or whatever, but like you could genuinely like see you could see like a vision of the new world in organizing. I don't know. I wonder to what degree that acts as like disinfectant. I don't know or like guardrails around like the ability to be sort of co-opted. I don't know. I'm just curious. Anyway, yes.
I think that's a really good point. And not only were parties like the SPD like organizing, civic social life, right? That's what you're pointing to.
Yeah, exactly.
But they were, when those parties existed, the capitalist political parties had to like rise to meet that challenge, right? Which is kind of your point. Like even the capitalist parties did some version of this, right?
Yeah.
In the absence of that kind of like proletarian socialist party, like even capitalist politics becomes mendacious, right? And like kind of flat, right? It becomes like in a way apolitical. It was only ever really political because it was contested by proletarian socialism.
I mean, there's a you're right. I mean, there's like a famous demassification of American parties, right? They don't need to organize people in the same ways that, historically they had to in like, even in like high labor in like the 1940s or 50s or whatever.
Right. If we were organizing, a proletarian socialist politics today, we would understand capitalist politics better than we do now, right? And capitalist politics would, as it were, be forced to explain itself to us, right? If there were that kind of political challenge.
I guess this was like a couple questions ago, I feel like, but I think part of the reason I am interested in a positive vision of socialism, even a minimalistic one, is like almost for the opposite reason of what, I don't know that guy, whatever his name is, what he was saying, because he was talking about how like people can be persuaded that the socialists who are fighting for them are actually not, or something, blah, blah, blah.
We're losing our quorum, and I'm hungry. So
Okay,
I think maybe this is a good time to transition to drinks.
Okay.
Tunes.
Yeah.